Hello and welcome to the Book of Revelation, Historicist View. This is part 17, When Two Worlds Collide, and we are Lebanon Springs House. Thank you for joining me today. I want to apologize for sounding a little rough. I've been dealing with some congestion, but I didn't want to put off recording this any longer because I'm going to be very busy in the next few weeks with some other projects. So I hope that it's going to be that you'll be able to understand me through all of this. I also want to thank you for your patience. This has been a long time in coming, I know. And I want you to know I appreciate your questions, your comments, and especially your enthusiasm. They don't always speed up the process, I know, but they're very encouraging to me. And even though you've had to wait again for this video, I trust it's going to prove to have been worth the wait. And as always, we begin today with a review of our last video that we entitled The Last Trump, or The Seventh Trumpet Sounds. We saw yet another earthquake, and it was followed by a hailstorm, which possibly symbolized the sweeping away of lies that had propped up the beast kingdom for so long, not to mention opening the eyes of God's people to his truths once again. We also saw that history bears out two great revolutions, the American Revolution, of course, of 1776, and the French Revolution of 1789. Remember, we've still been discussing the second interval period by way of parenthetical or character chapters. We have to remember that both of these revolutions are going to lay the groundwork for the coming bowl judgments. And at this point, it should come as no surprise that one of these earthquakes could be touted as the Great Escape, while the other could be seen as the Great Entrapment. Today, in chapter 12, we meet a woman. Now, this is not the only woman highlighted in this book, but it is the first. And looking at the Greek word used here, it's number 1135. It's gune, and its meaning is a woman, but more specifically a wife. And this is important when we look at who this woman symbolizes. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to suggest that this woman represents the true church. Okay, I believe we can support that from Scripture. But from their article entitled, "Who Are the Woman, Child, and Dragon?" lifehopeandtruth.com tell us, in the New Testament, God's church is symbolized as a woman, and its members are likened to virgins. The New Testament church is called the Israel of God, and likened to Jerusalem above, which is called the mother of us all. Members of the church are described as a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his, meaning God's, own special people. Now, when we look to the scriptures to interpret itself, we see that the book of Isaiah in chapter 54 also uses this word gune. "For thy maker is thine husband, Yahweh of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. The God of the whole earth shall he be called, for Yahweh hath called thee as a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth when thou wast refused, saith thy God." Now, to drive home the point that this woman of chapter 13 is the true church, the wife of God, it's helpful to look at the quote-unquote other woman, and we find her in chapter 17. In the King James Version, he's not very, shall we say, nice. He calls her the whore. That Greek word is number 4204. It's porne, and that is exactly where we get our word pornography from. It means idolater, harlot, or whore. In keeping with the symbolism, I would like to suggest that this woman of chapter 17 represents the false church, who traffics in idolatry. And she is, of course, controlled by the second main character of today's chapter, the red dragon. Now, looking to the symbolism of verses 1 and 2, we read, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered." This word wonder is used many times in the New Testament, and often as is in here, it really means a sign. So that's interesting that John, or should I say Yeshua, is giving us a sign about this woman. And verse 3 and 4 say, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born." So that wonder also is a sign. And interestingly, dragons appear at least 19 times in the scriptures, but the book of Revelation alone boasts of a red dragon. Five and 6 tell us that the woman brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her 1,260 days. First, I want you to notice the phrase man-child. That's not the usual way we refer to baby boys. And then we're going to see later that this proves difficult for some commentators, but I happen to believe that this wording is very deliberate because it's meant to convey something out of the ordinary. Notice also the time period that we discussed at length in our last video, 1,260 days, translating, of course, to 1,260 years. And next we're going to address the symbolism found in verses 7 through 9. Verses 7 and 8 read, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought with his angels. But they prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven." I believe this is key to understanding the entire chapter, really. This seems to me to be telling us there was a time when the dragon was in heaven, but at this point in history lost his standing, so to speak. Now, we can think perhaps of the original rebellion, where Satan came to earth and tempted Adam and Eve, but considering the placement of this event within the chapter itself, we're going to see that this speaks of a separate event. Verse 9 tells us unequivocally who the dragon is. "And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole earth. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Now, as I said, we can be fairly certain this was not the original rebellion, because that took place about 6,000 years ago at the very least. And we should remember that in the book of Job, Satan still had access before the throne, as we see in this next verse. "And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night." And in verse 11, we see that they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. This is connected to the our brethren in the last verse that the serpent accused. And every inference in this verse speaks of the martyrs of this second interval period. Could it be anyone other than the two witnesses? And verse 12, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. You know, if the timing of this event is correct, this great wrath was the reason for the war the beast kingdom waged on the saints. Verse 13 tells us, and when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. Now it's very clear which woman is being spoken of here, because this is the woman who brought forth the man-child, and whomever she represents, she is persecuted first. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. It would seem that after a period of persecution, we're going to be looking for some event where at the very least she has respite from that persecution. The fact that this woman is given 2 wings of a great eagle may possibly have multiple meanings, but this is not a foreign idea to God's people, as we shall see in the interpretation portion of today's video. Now, what happens next seems a bit bizarre. We're told, and the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. So apparently this dragon spews so much water out of his mouth that it becomes a flood, and it's meant to carry the woman away. It's going to be pretty interesting to see the interpretation of these events, don't you think? But wait, there's more. Verse 16 tells us the woman has help. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. This is a great illustration of this verse on the right here. Try to keep it in mind as we explore the meanings later. You've got that red dragon in the back spewing water out of all 7 mouths apparently, and you can see that it's become a flood, but there's the earth which opens up. So a great picture. What could it mean? Next we see in verse 17, and the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. There again we see the very familiar now description of Yeshua's audience. And this again is key to the bigger picture. Yeshua is being very clear when he tells us that the dragon's unsuccessful attempts to persecute the woman lead to plan B. He can't harm the woman, so he's going to go after her children. And you know, that ought to raise the hair on the back of everyone's neck. Before we go into the interpretation portion, I want to quickly go through these symbols in this chapter. I'm going to be organizing them, hopefully in a clearer way. Remember, chapter 12 is an overview, it's not details. So it's going to be helpful to tidy up just a little bit before we do the interpretation. And by this, I simply mean, for example, we're told in the first few verses that the woman goes into the wilderness. And then we're told about the war in heaven and how the dragon is cast out and makes war against the woman. He persecutes her. And then she's given 2 wings to go to the wilderness. Well, the point is the woman doesn't go to the wilderness twice. I believe the narrator is just giving more details as he goes along. So I think the order is as follows. A woman clothed with the sun, being with child, is about to deliver. And then a dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns is also ready to devour her child. The man-child who will rule with a rod of iron is delivered. he's caught up to God and to his throne. There's war in heaven, and the dragon is defeated and cast out, followed by praise in heaven and a warning towards the earth. The dragon then persecutes the woman who flees to the wilderness, but he casts out a flood of water to overtake her. The earth helps the woman by swallowing up that flood. And finally, the dragon then makes war with the remnant of her seed. And by now, we should really be thinking of the two witnesses. Well, we have reached the interpretation portion of today's video, and the historicist view, I believe, falls a little short. Now, I can agree with some of their assertions, but I feel they had a bias against the Jews and really all things Old Testament, and that probably clouded their judgment just a bit. I hope that's going to become clear as we go through today and even future videos. I've said before that I believe they didn't go far enough when exiting Babylon. So my view about the symbols in this chapter are going to slightly differ from those of most historicists, and that probably doesn't surprise you by now. Taking kind of an amalgamation of many of our familiar Bible commentators, Adam Clarke, Albert Barnes, John Gill, Matthew Henry there, the historicist view is somewhat of a puzzle piece to me. It goes something like this. The Christian church, as about to be enlarged, represented by the condition of the woman, in the early period of the history of the church, with her archenemy, the papal church, stationed to prevent its increase and to accomplish its destruction, but being protected in a manner by Constantine's favor, as represented by its being caught up to God. Let's condense this, shall we? Again, they say the woman is the Christian church. The man-child is, in fact, that church, because it's about to be enlarged or have its period of growth. And her arch enemy is, of course, the papal church. The man-child being caught up to God, or this growth of the church being protected, according to their view, was by Constantine's favor. Remember, when Constantine became the first Christian emperor, his favor did enable the church to grow when Rome would have stamped it out completely. So I get what they're saying here. However, I have an issue with the archenemy being the papal church, because at this period of time, around 303 AD, when Constantine rose to power, the Roman Church had not yet morphed into the Roman Catholic Church as we speak of it today, nor had the office of the papacy yet usurped power for itself. So I'm going to differ a little bit. I think all of these commentators would agree with me that the point isn't that we have, or we're going to get a definitive rendering of every detail of this book. There's going to be some soft spots, okay? That being said, this still seems to me to be more of a puzzling piece, on its face. So rather than just look to the small puzzle pieces, if you will, we're going to look at the bigger picture here. I think it's most helpful. And there's at least one commentary that agrees with me, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, written in 1871, who thinks this depicts several things. First, the enmity between the woman and the serpent of Genesis, the victory from Messiah's birth, death, and resurrection. It also depicts the persecution of the Jews just before they flee into obscurity, and the Roman counterfeit church as it persecutes the two witnesses. So again, in this scenario, the woman is going to be Israel. The dragon is really the serpent devil, and the man-child is the Messiah. His birth, death, and particularly his resurrection is him being caught up to God in his throne. The persecution of the woman is really the persecution of the Jews, as we're going to see, and as she flees into the wilderness or obscurity, just before the dragon turns his attention to those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Yeshua, the two witnesses, and that persecution, of course, will be done by the Roman counterfeit church. So, having discussed both of these variations of this interpretation, we're going to move now to these symbols themselves, and of course I will be working off the latter vision, the one that incorporates Israel as the woman rather than the church. Looking at, again, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, they tell us the church, Israel first, and then the Gentile church, clothed with Christ, the Son of Righteousness. The church is the bearer of the divine supernatural light in the world. Now, this might seem contrary to what I just said, but the commentary is going to delineate the difference as it continues. The sun, moon, and 12 stars are emblematical of Jacob, Leah, or else Rachel, and the 12 patriarchs, the Jewish church as they call it. And Mr. Albert Barnes adds, the church, according to one view, is not simply regarded as Jewish, but in a more general and theocratic sense as the people of God. He says, from the Christian church, he, the Messiah, could not spring. Even here, Mr. Barnes realizes that to make the woman the church would be problematic, because the man-child, if he is the Messiah, that wouldn't work, right? Perhaps that's why he takes the other view, that the man-child represents the church growing in numbers during Constantine's reign. Well, I included Mr. Barnes' comment here because it really makes the case for me that if we see the woman as Israel, and I think that's going to be pretty clear, then the man-child has to be Messiah, or vice versa. If we look at this child and say, no, that really looks like Messiah, then the woman can't be what we call the church. It's got to be more of Old Testament saints or Israel. But I'm going to get ahead of myself again. Now, others also take this view of things, and lifehopeandtruth.com, in an article entitled, Who Are the Woman, the Child, and Dragon in Revelation 12, says the woman of the apocalypse, described as being clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars, represents Old Testament Israel. In the Old Testament, God referred to his people as a woman whom he had dressed in honor and splendor. The garland with 12 stars may be symbolic, they say, of the 12 tribes of Israel. You know, one of the first rules of interpretation, even when working with symbolism, is to take the plainest meaning. And the book of Revelation itself, you know, is very helpful. We know this already, right? It tells us the identity of the dragon outright. The identity of the woman, however, though not specifically divulged, can be clearly seen from the other symbolism in scriptures themselves. Next, Christine Miller of the Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed concurs with this thought when she says, a woman is introduced who is the mother of a male child. The woman is not at first identified, but the crown of 12 stars helps. A star is a spiritual authority. 12 of them calls to mind the 12 tribes of Israel. She continues, the woman gives birth to a male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Now you can find that in the book of Psalms and 2 other references in the book of Revelation. They leave no doubt that this man-child is the Messiah because of this ruling the nations with a rod of iron. She goes on to say that this does indeed identify the child as the Messiah and Redeemer, Jesus Christ our Lord. And next, verse 3 speaks of a red dragon, and ChristianStudyLibrary.org suggests his color is fiery red. They say we saw earlier in the book of Revelation that fiery red is the color of warfare. Here she's, of course, making a reference to the second seal, the red horse of Rome's period of disorder. They say where there is warfare, there is blood. Satan has conquered many. His slain are a mighty throng. And Mr. Barnes suggests the word properly means a large serpent. 2 special characteristics are stated by John in the general description of the dragon. One, that it's red in color, and the other is that it was a great dragon. Now, with today's focus on dragons and such, we don't necessarily make the connection that this dragon is the old serpent. But looking to the etymology of this Greek word drakon, meaning a serpent, we see that it came from the Greek and even into the Old French and Middle English, meaning, denoting a large serpent. So John, even though he doesn't tell us until verse 9 the identity of this dragon, clearly the language already reveals it. Brian DeVos from ChristianStudyLibrary.org heightens our awareness of this being. He says a dragon is an overgrown serpent. In view here is his cunning, his craftiness, his deception. Appearing as a serpent, he succeeded in alluring our first parents into sin. If such was his success when Adam and his wife stood in righteousness, he asks then how much easier is his success with the fallen sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. As this sign appears in heaven, he tells us that John writes, "Behold." This is a command given to look at this sign. He says, look at this hideous and grotesque creature. Indeed, Satan may masquerade as an angel of light, but here the masquerade is torn away. Here we see him for what he is, a great fiery red dragon. Mr. Voss says, you may not wish to look at him. You may wish rather to ignore him. But to ignore him is to fall prey to him. You will never withstand the wiles of the devil by ignoring him. You may not wish to look upon him, but you must. Heed the command and look at the sign. It is intended for your benefit. I'm fairly certain Mr. Voss is thinking very broadly here, but I would absolutely affirm his counsel. Perhaps Yahweh is beginning to open your eyes to some things, and it would be easier to look away. But if our eyes are being opened, shouldn't we trust that it's for our benefit? Just because I believe that this revelation scenario is wrapping up, and I do very much believe that, it doesn't mean we don't need to reflect upon where we stand at this period in time. We very much need to, all the more as time is running out. Now that's about as drama as I'm going to get. But when the smoke clears, I want to find us all standing firm in that faith once delivered to the saints. Next, in verse 3, we learn that this dragon has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. Even though it's been a while since we looked at Daniel's beast, that should sound pretty familiar. Remember, his beast had 7 heads, and this is just a 7-headed dragon. And Christine Miller from the Revelation of Jesus Christ Revealed tells us that if we count the heads and horns on these 4 beasts of Daniel's vision, we come up with 7 heads and 10 horns. In other words, Daniel and John are seeing the same thing. Daniel saw 4 distinct beasts or ruling empires because they were future to him. At least he was living during the reign of the first beast. John saw a single beast, the great dragon, because for the most part these beasts were all passed to him. He was living as we are during the reign of the 4th beast. Now that might sound strange because we've looked at the Roman Empire as having fallen. But we know that the reincarnation, the image of that beast, arose, and even though that has been kind of squelched for a period, we're still living in that time because it's going to be Messiah's return that is going to be the finale to put this beast in the chains it belongs in. So in that sense, we still are living in the reign or the shadow of the reign of that 4th beast of Daniel because, we have government, earthly government. And as I have said before, all governments, even good governments, are going to succumb to the Messiah, to his reign when he returns. Praise be the Lord. In verse 4, we learned that this dragon draws a third part of the stars from heaven and casts them to the earth, to which the Jamieson Fawcett Brown commentary says, in the Greek, draweth or drags down. His dragging down the stars with his tail, suggesting a lashing back and forward in his fury, implies, they say, his persuading to apostatize, like himself, and to become earthly, those angels. Now, we have seen this in the scripture before when Daniel confronts or tells us of a confrontation between 2 animals, 2 of his beasts. Quote, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great towards the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Now, for context, Daniel is describing a confrontation between Media-Persia, the ram, and Grecia, the he-goat. We know this because Daniel interprets it that way just in the following verses. In this chapter, Daniel tells us that the he-goat, or Grecia, had one notable horn that had been broken, and commentators agree that that would be Alexander the Great. Next, Daniel tells us that the horn that is broken off, 4 more horns come up in its place. And commentators also agree that this symbolizes Alexander's 4 generals who divide his kingdom. In the verses before us, more specifically, Daniel is telling us that a little horn comes up out of one of the 4 horns and begins to make its way toward the pleasant land. Now, I believe that's the Holy Land. And commentators also agree that this little horn is representative of Antiochus Epiphanes, whose very name means God manifest. This little horn from the book of Daniel also reaches up to heaven to cast down the host and the stars to the ground. Again, really showing the power behind Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a type of Antichrist. Now, we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 24 in just a bit, and hopefully clear up some confusion about Jesus' words there as he references the book of Daniel. So, if we could link all of these pictures, we see that this red dragon is really the old serpent, devil, or Satan, and he has 7 heads, and he acts like the little horn of Daniel, which is a type of Antichrist. This is definitely an amalgamation of really all of the tentacles that this beast has. Verse 5 tells us that the man-child is caught up to God and his throne, and we've already alluded to the fact that this is best explained by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, our Messiah. And there are well over 100 Bible verses which speak to Christ ascending to the throne, to the right hand of God. So it's kind of hard to deny that this is really the picture we're getting. And we get the idea that this is more than plausible. Now, as concerns verse 6, we're going to cover that with verses 14 through 16 because they all detail the woman fleeing into the wilderness. This is what I alluded to earlier about it being kind of jumbled, the actual chronology, if you will, of this. So we're going to skip verse 6 for now and move on to verses 7 through 10. This detailed the war in heaven and Satan's being cast out. And the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary remind us why Satan was in heaven in the first place. In Job chapters 1 and 2 and in Zechariah chapter 3, Satan appears among the sons of God, presenting himself before God in heaven as the accuser of the saints. But at Christ's coming as our Redeemer, he fell from heaven, especially when Christ suffered, rose again, and ascended to heaven. When Christ appeared before God as our advocate, Satan, the accusing adversary, could no longer appear before God against us, but was cast out judiciously. Wow, doesn't that just fill you with joy and peace? Not to mention a sense that this view is kind of correct. They continue. He and his angels henceforth ranged through the air and the earth. And after a time, namely the interval between the ascension and the second advent, about to be cast hence also and bound in hell. He says that heaven here does not mean merely the air, but the abode of angels. They say it was fittingly ordered that as the rebellion arose from unfaithful angels and their leader, so they should be encountered and overcome by faithful angels and their archangel in heaven. Michael is peculiarly the prince or presiding angel of the Jewish nation. The conflict in heaven, though judiciously decided already against Satan from the time of Christ's resurrection and ascension, receives its actual completion in the execution of judgment by the angels who cast out Satan from heaven. From Christ's ascension, he has no standing ground judicially against the believing elect. Now stop and take that in. That doesn't mean he can no longer tell lies, but his only audience is you, and that'll preach. Hence, neither was their place found any more in heaven. Now, verse 11 corresponds with verse 17. That's all about the war with the remnant, so I will include it there and move on to verse 12. And there's a jubilance in heaven, strangely mixed with a foreboding for earth dwellers, because the evil one who had before darkened the doorway of heaven no longer has admittance to the heavenly realm, and so there's a lot of rejoicing in heaven. But woe to the earth dwellers, because the evil one who had sometimes walked to and fro in the earth now resides full time on earth until he is thrown into the lake of fire. And now we turn our attention to verses 6 and 13 and 14 that tell us the woman is given 2 wings to fly into the wilderness, where she will be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. Well, again, we look to the Word of God for the meaning of these things. Exodus chapter 19, verse 4 says, "Ye have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself." Isaiah chapter 40 records, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." And finally in Deuteronomy chapter 32, "As an eagle stirs up her nest, flutters over her young, spreads abroad her wings, takes them, bears them on her wings, so the Lord, Yahweh, alone did lead Jacob." And of course, this is talking about the Hebrew children through the wilderness. So we see this is already an established picture in the scriptures of Yahweh's protection and provision for his people. Now, because this is a recording of a keynote presentation, I'm unable to incorporate videos. However, in the description area of this installment, you can find a link to a short but beautiful video from Our Daily Bread entitled Psalm 23, Finding Safety in the Wilderness. I highly recommend it, as it emphasizes how much the flocks living in the wilderness lands have to depend upon their shepherds for survival. And yet the Creator, already knowing this, put into the environment itself the necessary provision. It renders the wilderness almost a lovely place, albeit deadly if the flocks are disobedient. You'll really want to check that out. We've already established that the woman is Israel, the 12 tribes, or the Old Testament saints, if you will, technically speaking, who birthed the Messiah, or the man-child, because the Israel of old had been waiting for the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head ever since Genesis chapter 3. Now, after the man-child is delivered, that is to say, Messiah is caught up to God in his throne via his death and resurrection, the dragon turns to persecute this woman, which is the cause of her fleeing to the wilderness. But the woman at this time in history only consists of the Yehudim, the tribe of Judah, and some Benjamites, most often referred to as the Jews. Remember, the other 10 tribes have been scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. Only the Jews are known to this enemy. Think about that. The lost 10 tribes were not only lost to themselves and to their brethren, but I believe they were lost to the enemy as well. He didn't have a clue about their identity until they were drawn back to Jesus Christ. So this is the woman who flees to the wilderness. And when the dragon sees that his attempts to inundate the Jews with some kind of flood are unsuccessful, his rage is turned upon the remnant of her seed, the Christians. Now let me remind you that for centuries after Messiah's resurrection, it can be proven that they were still keeping the commandments of God, while holding the testimony of Yeshua, Jesus Christ. And that's why they're referred to here in this revelation as those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. So we have to show that the Jews were not only persecuted after Messiah's resurrection, but that they were scattered to the quote-unquote wilderness once again. Now, we already know what it looks like when the dragon turns on the remnant of the woman's seed. We've talked extensively about the war this beast waged on the two witnesses. That is, we've talked about the war waged on the remnant of her seed. We're now going to talk about the war he waged on the Jewish people just prior to that. And we're going to begin with the definition of the Jewish diaspora or exile, being the dispersion of the Israelites out of their ancient ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, and their subsequent settlement in other parts of the globe. Now, that's just a general definition. We're going to dive a bit into the history in order to prove that there was in fact persecution of the Jews just after Messiah's resurrection or his being caught up to the throne, and prior to the beast turning upon the Christians. Now, this map showing exile of the ancient Jewish people beginning around 539 BC, and the red arrows being the Assyrian exile routes out of Israel into portions of Persia and Syria. Next, we see the Babylonian exile, where the southern kingdom of Judah were taken to Babylon, but then allowed to return, represented there by the dotted blue line, just after 70 years. And then we see the larger dispersion throughout the Roman Empire. This is according to the yellow lines. It's this Roman dispersion that we want to focus upon because we're looking for a time period after the Messiah is resurrected, sometime after 30 to 33 AD. And just after a couple of decades, we find the Great Revolt of 66 AD or CE, the Common Era, which saw the Jews displaced to Crete, Egypt, and Rome. At the Second Temple's destruction in 70 AD, the Jews are further removed to Persia, Iraq, Arabia, and east of the Euphrates River towards Kurdistan. Now, just as a point of history, once Jewish communities were moved out of the Holy Land, particularly Judea and Jerusalem, even Babylon, history has divided the Jews into specific categories, the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic. And again, that's just to say that these two main groups encompass a large portion of the descendants of those early peoples who were being pushed out of the Roman Empire. Now, the word Ashkenaz really was the grandson of Noah through Japheth, who's believed to have even been the progenitors of the people of Rome, hence the Eastern Jewish community being called Ashkenazi. And Sephardic, or Sepharad, is the Hebrew word for Spain. And so a large number of Hispanics around the world we find will have Jewish roots, which is very interesting to say the least. But let's look at this migratory map from 547 all the way to 1650. The black arrows represent voluntary migrations, as opposed to the brown arrows representing expulsions. What is clear is that very soon after Messiah's resurrection, we will see that the Jewish people became a completely diasporic community, living outside of the homeland of Israel. And while we're talking about migration routes, there are some who think it's quite possible that the Jewish people found their way to the early Americas. In an interesting article from Harvard, the Harvard Crimson, entitled "Did Hebrews Discover America?" the author explains, should we really have celebrated Columbus Day last week? Not according to a Brandeis professor who says that ancient Hebrews reached America 1,300 years before Columbus. These explorers allegedly set foot in the New World around 135 AD. Quote, "There was more than one boatload," says Cyrus H. Gordon last Sunday. "Perhaps it was a two-way affair, with some colonists returning to the Old World to spread the news. We do not know how long this colony lasted." Gordon, professor of Mediterranean studies at Brandeis, claimed that Hebrew refugees fleeing Roman oppression crossed the Atlantic, perhaps with the aid of Phoenician navigators. They eventually settled in Tennessee and Kentucky, he said. Gordon based his theory on a stone uncovered in a Tennessee Indian burial mound. He claims that inscriptions on the stone are ancient Hebrew characters that say, "For the land of Canaan." Although a Smithsonian Institute team discovered the stone in 1885, no one thought it significant until Gordon studied it. A colleague sent a picture of the rock to Gordon, who said he realized that the stone had been photographed and studied upside down. He then deciphered the characters. Now, I think the title of this article is somewhat of a spoof, and he's not really suggesting that the Jews discovered America. But he wouldn't be the only person to suspect the presence of some kind of Hebraic community in the early Americas long before their first touted migrations in the early 1500s. It turns out that the early Mayan civilization quite possibly traded with King Solomon, and Stanford University has an article, "The Indians Who Came from Ophir," say that these original inhabitants, the Aboriginal people of Brazil, whom Brandau depicts as provident and skillful traders, actively engaging in business with the colonizers, are the same people whose origin he investigates in relation to the Old Testament's history of the Jews. The Brazilian Indians are the descendants of an ancient tribe sent by King Solomon to the celebrated land of Ophir in order to fetch wood for the construction of the Temple of God. Now, this article is examining the work of Ambrosia Fernandes Brandão, a Portuguese soldier. He's a writer. He authored at least 2 works on the history of Brazil. And he, like many others, was a new Christian convert to the region who practiced Judaism in secret. Brandão claimed that the Brazilian Indians are descended from children of Israel who reached the Americas during the reign of Solomon. The article goes on to say that the debate about the origin of the American Indians was very prominent among early modern authors concerned with the discovery of the New World. It cites Paracelsus, a Swiss physician, alchemist, a theologian. He was a philosopher of the German Renaissance. He even entertained the idea that, quote, "the inhabitants of the New World were not necessarily descended from the Adam of Genesis." This article is also going to quote Gregorio Garcia's work. He wrote a huge treatise covering the many theories that were available at the time on the subject. And all of these authors relate the American Indians to the Jews, but unlike Paracelsus, Brandão and Garcia don't defend pre-Adamic theories. Garcia, however, did view the relation as something negative, and that seems to have been the case with most of the authors of that period of whose opinions he produces. They continue, "It seems that this was the predominant position at the time, as remarked recently by Lucia Helena Costigan. She gives only 2 examples of early modern authors who viewed the kinship between the Indians and Jews from a positive perspective. That would be the Portuguese Jesuit Antonio Vieira and Manasseh ben Israel, who established the first Hebrew press of the Netherlands. As this essay will show, Ambrosia Fernandes Brandão should be added to that list." So again, it's just saying that there were serious authors, historians, who have gone on record as saying that the presence of Jewish communities were in the early Americas long before the medieval days, when we know they started looking and coming along with the Puritans looking for respite from persecution. Now, to just say that the Jews were heavily persecuted after Christ's resurrection means very little. We need to look at some documentation that this is the case or was the case, and we're going to look at this idea of anti-Semitism from the Anti-Defamation-League.org and their article entitled "A Brief History of Anti-Semitism." They say it's as ancient as biblical times. Abraham, the father of 3 major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, led his family to Canaan almost 1,000 years before the Common Era, where a new nation, the people of Israel, came into being. During those centuries before Christ, the Hebrews, or the early Jewish people, experienced intermittent persecution because they refused to adopt the religion of the locale or ruler and worship the idols of the kingdoms of the Middle East, as was the custom at the time. This refusal to worship idols was seen as stubborn, and it was resented. After the advent of Christianity, a new anti-Judaism evolved. Initially, Christianity was seen as simply another Jewish sect, since Jesus and the disciples were Jewish and preached a form of Judaism. However, in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Romans destroyed the Jewish state, and most Jews were scattered throughout the ancient world. During the first few hundred years after the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans, adherents of both Judaism and Christianity coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with animosity, as they sought to practice their faiths in the same lands. And I find it very interesting that this is a great resource, a brief history of anti-Semitism, a great resource to prove once again that the early Christians and their Jewish brethren were coexisting, getting along. That's going to change. The Jews are going to force out those who believe that that Jesus is the Messiah, and then of course we're going to have the church morphing into something different. But there is recorded history that there was a time when there were not two separate entities, as it were. But we want to look again at the treatment of the Jews by Rome. In 63 BC, the Constitutional Rights Foundation tells us, the Romans conquered Judea, the land of the Jews. Rome immediately recognized it had a problem because the Jews refused to pay homage to Roman gods. So Rome gave in and exempted Jews from this requirement. It did so in part because the Jews had helped Roman general Julius Caesar win an important battle several years earlier. Soon Rome recognized Judaism as a legal religion, allowing Jews to worship freely. But Rome viewed the Jews with suspicion and persecuted them on several occasions. One of the most serious conflicts between Rome and the Jews began in Judea in AD 66 when Nero was emperor. The Roman governor of Judea unwisely decided to confiscate a large sum of money from the treasury of the great temple in Jerusalem. He claimed he was collecting taxes owed the emperor. Rioting broke out, which Roman soldiers ruthlessly suppressed, and this in turn enraged a nationalistic group of Jewish revolutionaries called Zealots, who massacred the Romans in Jerusalem and attacked Roman troops elsewhere in the Roman province. Nero sent 3 legions to put down the rebellion. By summer of the year 68, Rome had restored its control over most of the province. 2 years later, the Romans retook Jerusalem and destroyed the great temple, the center of the Jewish religion. Fighting continued for a few more years until the Zealot fortress at Masada fell. My family and I were blessed in 2018 with a trip to Israel, and we were able to stay for 5 weeks. It was our first trip, and we actually got to go to the fortress at Masada. And looking down from above, seeing the remains of the Roman bulwark or ramp up the steep incline, as well as the encampment below, learning the history of Masada, how almost 1,000 Israelites vowed to not be taken by the Romans. They all agreed to end their lives on that hilltop rather than watch what the Roman soldiers would do to their families. One could easily feel not only the desperation, but the deliberation that must have gone into such a decision. We as Americans hardly know our own history, much less that of the Jewish people or any other ethnic group. But I choose to look at this history as our history because I believe Christians are inextricably connected to the Jewish people. We share a Jewish Messiah. We share the same God. We certainly share the same scriptures, Old Testament anyway. But we also share our roots in that natural olive tree known as the Commonwealth of Israel. We just really need a good old-fashioned family reunion. Next, the Anti-Defamation League picks up again, telling us that with the conversion of the Roman emperors, Christianity became the sole established religion of the Roman Empire, and the early church fathers sought to establish Christianity as the successor to Judaism. The refusal of the Jews to accept Jesus as the Messiah was viewed as a threat to the Roman rulers and to Christianity. Since both religions came from the Old Testament, Christians then sought to establish the validity of their new religion by claiming that it superseded Judaism. During the next 3 centuries, a new pattern of institutionalized discrimination against Jews occurred. Jews were forbidden to marry Christians, were prohibited from holding positions in government, and were prevented from appearing as witnesses against Christians in court. As Jews were officially being ostracized, certain bizarre fantasies about Jews arose in Northern Europe that foreshadowed the anti-Semitism of the 20th century. It was alleged that Jews had horns and tails and engaged in ritual murder of Christians. The latter allegation, referred to as blood libel, was devised by Thomas of Monmouth in 1150 to explain the mysterious death of a Christian boy, and this theme recurs throughout English and German myths. Specifically in verse 13, we're told that the dragon was cast to the earth and persecuted the woman who brought forth the man-child. And in the very next verse, she is given 2 wings to fly away into the wilderness where she is nourished. Now this is going to become clear as we continue, but right now I want to focus on the sweeping floods of the Bible. And we're going to begin with the book of Isaiah, chapter 8, verse 7, where we learn, "Now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria in all his glory. And he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks." Next, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 46, "Who is this that cometh up as a flood, whose waters are moved as the rivers? Egypt rises up like a flood, and his waters are moved like the rivers. And he says, I will go up and will cover the earth. I will destroy the city and the inhabitants thereof." We have talked about symbolism for a long time now, and we've seen that the waters in the book of Revelation symbolizes multitudes of people. Revelation itself tells us that. So to speak of these nations whose waters or people flow into other cities to destroy them, rising up like a flood, well, it certainly fits the usual Revelation language. But there's one more example that I want to use, and I believe it cinches this idea of floods being invasions. And it is Daniel chapter 9 that we looked at extensively in this series. In chapter 9, this is where we saw the Messiah being the one who confirms or strengthens the new covenant of the book of Jeremiah. And it turned out to be the Roman general Titus and his soldiers that destroyed the temple and the sanctuary. But look closely at what followed. "The end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined." So even though we remember that the people of the prince that were going to come and destroy the city, we saw that that was really disobedient soldiers, where Titus had said, please protect the sanctuary, and they disobeyed and burned it to the ground. But then he talks of this flood, and of course Antiochus and all of his soldiers coming into Jerusalem. And again, not only are they going to destroy the city, they're going to annihilate thousands, tens of thousands of Jews. And really that just was an ongoing part of this war that the dragon has been waging against the people of God forever. But really, Daniel is telling us until this war is over, bad things are going to continue to happen. And this is going to be particularly important considering where we are in Revelation right now. Later, as we look at Yeshua's words in Matthew chapter 24, he's going to refer back to this event, back to Daniel and the prophecy about Antiochus Epiphanes. And that will become very clear. So right now I want to move on to the idea of this dragon spewing water against the people of God, the Jews. We've already seen Yahweh makes it very clear that he has chosen to depict invasions as floods. But even if we can accept that Daniel is telling us, or the scriptures tell us that floods represent, again, invading armies, we still have to account for how the earth swallows up this flood. So let's do that now. And we're going to start by looking at the Greek words behind our English word earth. The Greek word number G1093 is gi, and its Hebrew equivalent H776, eretz. Both of these words really mean the earth, the ground, soil, region, or the land. Now, it's going to be necessary at this point to take just a moment to look at how the Bible treats the use of this word, particularly in the Hebrew. And in an article entitled The Land of Israel, Wikipedia.org tells us that the Hebrew Bible provides 3 specific sets or records of borders to the Promised Land, each with a different purpose. Now, neither the terms Promised Land or Land of Israel are used in these passages. In Genesis, in Ezekiel, and probably other places, these passages use strictly haaretz, the land or the earth, to describe the land promised explicitly to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't use the terms land of Israel. That's only used later once the people are in exile. It just says the land. And really my point is that for millennia, haaretz to Israelites means their homeland. It's what we would, call Israel today. So what if we could show that the land, haaretz, the earth, took a hit for the woman? That would fairly satisfy the symbolism here, wouldn't it? I think there's a very good reason, given the backdrop of the Jews being persecuted by the dragon right after Messiah is resurrected, to focus on what happened in Jerusalem that enabled the Jews of the diaspora to be sort of out of the reach of this beast. But let's set the stage. The previous 3 Gentile kingdoms, which subjected Israel to captivity before Rome, had already contributed to the fact that many Jews were not living in Israel during the sieges of Jerusalem by Pompey in 63 BC and that of Herod the Great just 27 years later. But even so, both of these events saw thousands of Jewish prisoners of war sold into slavery and shuffled throughout the empire. Now, the first Jewish-Roman war, known as the Great Revolt, we've talked about that earlier, which was really just a Jewish uprising for independence. And it was eventually crushed in 73 AD. This, of course, also when Jerusalem is besieged and the temple is burned to the ground. This also brought about a widespread diaspora, as we saw in some of those maps earlier. Actually, according to Jewish historian Josephus, about 97,000 Jewish captives from Judea were sold into slavery by the Romans during this revolt. Many other Jews fled voluntarily. Again, Jerusalem was devastated and the temple was destroyed. Now we're getting to the crux, I believe, of why this is connected to how the earth took a hit for the woman, or swallowed the flood of these Romans that the dragon spews out of his mouth. Just 60 years after the temple was destroyed, the Roman Emperor Hadrian visited Judea and decided to rebuild the city Many say it was he who renamed the city Aelia Capitolina. It's commonly held that this was done as an insult to the Jews and as a means of erasing the land's Jewish identity. Others think it was an attempt to challenge the growing threat of Christianity, because Jerusalem was likewise a crucial symbol of their faith as well. But again, just 60 years after the destruction of this temple, implementations of this plan triggered a full-scale insurrection with the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD. Now, this revolt was also crushed, and it led to the death and enslavement of the population of Jews. After this, the Jews were forbidden entrance into Jerusalem at all upon pain of death, except for the day of Tish B'Av. Now, this means that following the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews were reduced to a completely diaspora community. And this ban forbidding Jews to enter into Jerusalem struck a blow to Jewish national identity within what was now being called Palestine. However, and interestingly enough, the Romans continued to allow Jews in the diaspora their distinct national and religious identity throughout the entire empire. So you see, when the Roman armies flooded into Jerusalem, just 40 years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the woman, or the Jews, were indeed sent fleeing into the wilderness, or the diaspora, where she was protected and nurtured for a season, because the dragon's focus had then turned to the remnant of her seed. In fact, the diaspora communities in the far-flung reaches of the Roman Empire began to flourish in every way, and their ability to retain their Jewish identity and their connection with each other, I think, speaks greatly to that nurturing in the wilderness. One might even argue that the fact that there was such a large diaspora community at the time of the Second Temple destruction and the Bar Kokhba revolt might have been the saving of the Jewish people. Now, I'm sure that sounds strange today, but when you consider what might have happened to them as a people if that remnant hadn't been saved to come back into the land at the end of World War II, if they had been annihilated because they weren't outside of Jerusalem, if they had actually been in the homeland 2,000 years ago. You know, while we're also discussing this destruction of the temple, it's a good place to mention that I believe Jesus was prophesying in Matthew chapter 24. Of course, when he said, "When you see the abomination that causes desolation, get out of Jerusalem." Now, he is alluding to the fact, I think, of course, that Titus and his armies are going to come in and profane the temple just like Antiochus Epiphanes did. That's why Matthew inserts the parenthetical information, "let the reader understand." Matthew's winking at us. He's letting us know that the disciples are supposed to connect these two events. And right after that, Jesus gives a very brief overview of the coming events, the ones that he's going to elaborate on with John. So, in our final verse of today's portion, verse 17, we're told that the dragon, being very angry with the woman, after his unsuccessful attempts to do her in, turns his focus on the remnant of her seed, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is indeed the beast making war on the two witnesses. The woman has fled. The Jews are out of his reach. But the Christians, well, there's a whole empire full of them. And some of them are getting very worrisome to this beast, and it's going to be a problem. I feel like we just did a bit of a prequel. If I could recap chapter 12 one last time before we end, we saw the woman or wife who represents the true church, those of the Old Testament Israel giving birth, if you will, to the Messiah, and her children, the Gentile converts, keeping the commandments of God and holding the testimony of Yeshua. And we saw her archenemy, the dragon, that old serpent, the devil, who, like Israel, had been awaiting the arrival of the woman's seed who would crush his head. And he makes every attempt to devour him. And when he can't, he turns to persecute the Jews and finally the Christians. You know, in just a few chapters, we're going to meet the other woman, the whore who rides this beast. You know, this chapter of Revelation could be said to represent the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation, because there's one thread throughout this entire book, and that is good versus evil. And as I said last time, it's as if these two worlds collide right in the middle of this book of Revelation. Well, this wraps up our study today, and my family is getting ready to celebrate one of the most important Christian memorials that there is, the death and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. You know, there could be no resurrection if there hadn't been a Passover. And yet, if there were no resurrection, as Paul says, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. This is a great time to reflect on the faith once delivered to the saints, those ancient paths that our forefathers kind of lost sight of. I pray that in the days ahead, you and your family will find true meaning not only in the words of this great book, the Bible, but especially this love letter called Revelation. And next time when I return, chapter 13, that long-awaited chapter on the beasts of Revelation. We're going to take smaller bites of the book of Revelation when we look at part 18, A Sea Monster Rises. We're going to begin with chapter 13, verses 1 through 6, and we're going to look at the beast who has 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 crowns. And we're going to revisit the head which received its fatal wound but was reincarnated to the marvel of the whole world. And we're going to ask, just exactly what do the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire have in common? To find, well, one is the spitting image of the other. Join me next time, won't you, for the Book of Revelation Historicist View, Part 18, A Sea Monster Rises. Until then, stay well, keep studying, and shalom.